The Star Child's story begins in Mexico, about 100 miles southwest of Chihuahua, near the Copper Canyon area, not in it, but near it. It's a high desert area, like northern Arizona around the Grand Canyon or something like that. In about 1930, a family of Mexican heritage was returning to their home village for the first time in a number of years. They had several children, I think the oldest of whom was a girl about 13, 14, 15. In later life, she couldn't remember exactly how old she was, but she was in her teens. And when they arrived in this small village, the children were told, they were all told, that in the area they couldn't go in the caves or the mine tunnels, the old abandoned mine tunnels, because it was unsafe and it was just taboo and don't do it. So the girl decided that she wanted to explore and see what that was all about. So a few days later, she took a basket under the excuse of going out to look for some fruits or berries, and she was just going to go exploring, and she did, and she went a considerable distance away from the village and found a mine tunnel up an arroyo. She saw a mine tunnel, and she went up and she climbed up into it. And when she walked into that mine tunnel, some distance in, maybe 50 feet, where she could still see what she could see, she found a human skeleton lying on its back, looking up, on the dirt, just an exposed human skeleton. And she got a little closer and she saw that beside it was a mounded up pile of dirt from the floor that looked like a grave. And a little closer still, she noticed that coming out of that grave was what she called a misshapen hand. That was the word she chose, a misshapen hand. We don't really know what that meant. But that hand, she said, was wrapped around the upper arm bone of the human lying on the dirt. So that's a very dramatic scene, which meant, although she didn't understand it at the time, but it meant that the individual that was in the grave had died, and the individual lying on the dirt had buried it and left its hand sticking out. And to signify the closeness of their relationship, she wrapped it around her own arm, and then she laid there and died. She committed suicide in some way. We don't really know how, but there's no other way to account for that scene as the girl described it than what I've just said. So either romantic or dramatic or both, we don't really know. What the girl couldn't know, what we later found out, was that they had been lying there for 900 years. That was a 900-year-old burial. So it was quite special that she had managed to find it. Her first reaction was that it was the grave looked like it had not been compacted. The dirt looked fairly loose, and she assumed that if she just scraped the dirt away, she would find the other skeleton. And so she did that. She decided to dig it up, and she did. And she said that she found that the skeleton in the grave had a misshapen body. She said the word was that the whole skeleton was misshapen, like the hand. What that means, again, we don't really know. That was her word. And she said it was noticeably smaller than the other one. Now, based on the size of the head of the skull that she ultimately recovered, we know that the one lying on the ground was about 5 feet tall. Not uncommon for Mexicans to this day. So we assume that the one in the grave, since it was noticeably smaller, was in the range of 4 feet. These are just assumptions that we make. So she decided that because all the bones were there and she had a basket, she was going to recover the skeletons and take them, try to sneak them back into the States, maybe donate them to her school as exhibits. She assumed the misshapen one was just a deformity of some kind. She was just a kid. She wouldn't know any better. There was certainly no, UFOs or aliens in 1930, so it wouldn't have entered her mind to think anything but deformity. So she didn't have a plan for doing that, for sneaking them back in. So her first thought was, I have to hide these somewhere nearer to the village so that I can figure out a way to do this and then come back and get the bones and do it. So on the way back, she found a ravine coming down from an arroyo, kind of a ravine, and it has some trees and bushes on it, along it, and there was a tree and there was a shelf underneath that tree of a hollowed out area under the roots where she felt she could hide them very safely, and all of them, and they would be completely out of sight, a really good hiding place, which she did. And she was then going to come back once she figured out what to do with them. Well, that very night came a torrential rainstorm that lasted all that night, all the next day, all the next night, and then stopped. And so when she was able to go out to look to see if the bones were okay, what she found was that in the heavy rains, the arroyo had filled up. The flow of water that had undercut the roots to begin with had washed away all of the bones, gone, clean. And so she was, of course, upset, and she walked downstream and she found some bushes at the side, and they had snagged both skulls and the upper piece of maxilla of the misshapen skull, and she was able to recover that, the two skulls and the piece of maxilla, the detached piece of maxilla, and that was it. Both skulls had now suffered some damage in their tumble down the stream in the torrent that came down with the rocks and limbs and whatever else was in there. The human had lost one of its zygomatic arches, broken that off, and that's a pretty heavy bone, so it was a pretty good lick, whatever knocked it off. And the misshapen one had lost its lower face completely, and both of its zygomatic arches, both of its cheekbones, and it had lost a part under its neck called the basilar part. We don't know if that fell off because it wasn't fully detached, or if it was knocked off. We don't really know. But nonetheless, she was happy to have the two skulls. She considered that something, at least, and it was much easier to solve the problem of trying to sneak them back, two whole skeletons. So she kept the two skulls. Later in life, a few years later, she had them shellacked as a preservative, which was a common preservative in the 30s, which was a good thing because it really did protect the skulls from having the oils of hands seep into the bones. And then she put them in a cardboard box, basically, and put them in her garage and more or less just forgot about them. But she kept them for the course of her life, and in the early 90s, she found out that she had a terminal illness and was going to die. So when that happened, she wanted to find a home for them with somebody somewhere, and she had some friends, and she asked them if they would take her, what she considered souvenirs at that time. Would she keep her souvenirs, her skulls that she had? And they said, yeah, sure. What are you going to say to a dying woman? Yeah, sure, we'll do that, no problem. Well, then she died, and they kept them, that couple kept them for 5 years in their garage as well, in the same box. So after, they were never quite that easy with them, and they met a couple named Ray and Melanie Young from El Paso. All these people are from El Paso, Texas, in the States. And Ray and Melanie, it turned out, were an interesting choice because Melanie had, for 15 years, had been a neonatal nurse, and she had dealt with a lot of human deformity in those years, as anybody would. So human deformity, as she understood it, was not displayed by the unusual skull. And when she felt it, she could feel immediately that it was way too light. She could look at it and see that its parts were very, very different from a normal human skull, even a deformed human skull. And the symmetry, it was much too symmetrical, very, very different, but much too symmetrical to be any kind of a deformity that she was aware of. But on top of that, she and Ray both were members of El Paso MUFON, which is the Mutual UFO Network. And being members of that, they knew a lot about aliens and what aliens were supposed to look like. So she said to Ray, this looks like it could easily be the head of a gray skull because it has all the hallmarks of a gray, including, as you see, a crease in the top of the head that humans don't have. Humans just are rounded in that area. And grays are said to have a heart-shaped face with a little bit of a groove here, a roundness here on each side, which you have with these expanded parietals, and then a very, very reduced lower face. And in fact, this has all the hallmarks of a very reduced lower face. It physically looks like it could be a skull that would fit in a gray alien, the standard image that we have of a gray alien. So she said, I want to have this thing checked out. I want to have it determined what it is. And Ray agreed to that. So they went to the next MUFON meeting there in El Paso, and they put out the word to everybody there. Who in the field of alternative knowledge talks about skulls? Who knows about skulls that we can approach with this? And my name came up because at that time in '99 I was touring the country talking about a book I had written called Everything You Know Is Wrong, which dealt with an alternative view of human origins and a lot to do with hominoids, Bigfoot, the abominable snowman, things like that, and also what are called prehumans. And I compared the prehuman skulls to what the hominoid skulls were supposed to look like, and my argument was that they were the same, that they were not prehumans, they were actually hominoids. So people who had seen me do that presentation told Ray and Melanie, Lloyd Pye does a lot about skulls in his presentation, so why don't you contact him? So they did, and they asked me to come by the next time I was in the El Paso area, and that was going to be in a couple of months, in February, mid-February of '99. And so I said, I'll be on my way to a big conference in Las Vegas, in Laughlin, Nevada, near Las Vegas, and I can swing by then. And they said, great, love to see you, we'll wait for you. So I went by and visited with them, and fully expecting I was going to see something relating to Bigfoot. They didn't say what it was, they just said, we'll show you when you get here. So I assumed it was going to be related to hominoids in some way. And when they pulled these out of the box, it was quite a shock. It was absolutely the last thing I expected to see. And when they put the misshapen skull in my hands, I, just like Melanie, I knew enough about skulls to know this was very, very unusual, way too light, much too symmetrical. And I particularly understood the problems with the eye sockets because my father had been an optometrist for 40 years plus, and so I knew a lot about eyes, and I could see these were very otherworldly, unusual, weird eyes, but they were just perfect. I mean, just perfect. Different, but perfect, and that really didn't make sense to me. But even with all of that, my initial assessment was it has to be a deformity of some kind. It's the natural thing anybody would say when they first see something very, very unusual but has a general human look to it. Your first thought has to be it's a deformity. And if you don't know any better, that's what you're going to think. And Melanie knew better. It just so happened she knew better. I knew a little bit better, but the idea that I was holding an alien or a human alien hybrid in my hands was so difficult to accept, to wrap my mind around. I compare it to the shepherd that found the Dead Sea Scrolls and would have understood that, you know. It was on a par of unlikelihood with that, and I just didn't accept it. So I told them, I think it's probably going to be deformity of some kind or a combination of deformities, but I agree with you that it's very, very unusual, and I'm willing to undertake trying to find out what it is.